Welcome to this lesson on Touch by Hugh Lewin. This poem forms part of the current IEB Poetry syllabus for 2023 to 2025. A reminder before we get started that it is really important that you study this poem for yourself, that you actually spend time understanding it and analyzing it, and that you're able to explain it in your own words. This lesson really aims to supplement your studying and to help you deepen your understanding and broaden your knowledge, but it cannot replace your studying. You do need to put in that effort. Another reminder that while I try to be as comprehensive and detailed as possible in my analysis, you will find other observations and perspectives as you study the poem for yourself and as you do a bit of research on the poem. And this is completely fine. Poetry is not meant to be just one thing. It's meant to be subjective, but just make sure that whatever statements you're making, whatever you are interpreting in the poem can actually be substantiated by the poem, that there is actually evidence for what you are saying in your analysis. So let's jump into a quick background on the poet Hugh Lewin. He lived from 1939 to 2019. He was an absolutely prolific South African, not just, in the literary sphere and in the literary world, but as an anti-apartheid activist and just genuinely such a great role model and such a great person in our country's history. And so it's a really, really great privilege that we get to study his poetry. And, when his poem was first added to the IEB syllabus years ago, he actually gave insights into how to study this poem and how to look at this poem, which we'll see at the end of this lesson. But it's such a privilege for us to be able to study poetry that really it comes from our country's history. This poem is autobiographical in nature, and so it really is just such a privilege to study this poem. So if we have a quick look at him, he was born in the Eastern Transvaal. He went to Rhodes University. He worked as a journalist for very popular publications like the Natal Witness, Drum, and Golden City Post. As a journalist, he opposed the apartheid government and the apartheid regime, and he was a member of the Liberal Party and African Resistance Movement. And in the 1960s, he was part of a white former student group that really aimed to sabotage the apartheid regime's media infrastructure so that they could limit government propaganda. And for these crimes, he spent 7 years in the Pretoria Central Prison, and then 10 years in London, and then 10 years in exile in Zimbabwe. But in 1992, he returned to South Africa, and when our country entered the new era of democracy, he actually served on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC. He then became the director for the Institute of the Advancement of Journalism, and he released 3 works of literature that kind of delve into his time in prison and his time as an anti-apartheid activist. So, like I said, a really, really prolific human being and South African, and it's really cool that we get to study his literature, him being such an active part of our country's history. When we look at the structure and the style of this poem, the poem was written while he was imprisoned for his political activism. And so the poem expresses in very vivid detail the brutality that he faced within the prison as a prisoner of the apartheid system. That's why the speaker is probably the poet himself. It is quite an autobiographical poem where he's reflecting on his feelings, on his experiences in his time in prison. And so that's why it can be considered also a historical poem, because it's coming from our country's history. It's a moment in our country's history that has been captured in a poem, in literature. And many people also classify it as a protest poem. In explaining what has happened to him in the prison, he is actually protesting against the apartheid government and showing what happens and what they do to people who go against them. The poem is written in free verse, so there's no structured rhyme pattern or rhythm. And what we see is that the lines in this poem are very short, and there's a very sporadic rhythm. And what that is doing, it's reflecting his life that was marred, that was disrupted by these constant acts of cruelty. And so it's this life that's kind of like stop, start, stop, start. As you get abused, you then pick yourself up and you move on, and then a couple of hours or a couple of days later, you're beaten again, and then you have to pick yourself up and go again. And that's what we're going to see in this poem, in these short sporadic lines or sporadic rhythmic lines that we're going to see here. Building onto that, he uses very simple language. Now remember, simple language doesn't only refer to the vocabulary that you're using, it also refers to your sentence structure, to the way that you are expressing yourself. And so it's very, very simple language, because it is the poem is dealing with a very simple subject matter, which is the idea of human touch in different contexts and how that affects and influences people. So the main subject of the poem, like I said just now, is how normal human touch evades the prisoner. The prisoner does not receive normal human touch. They only receive invasive touch and physical abuse. We're going to see a sense of real desperation in this poem, that he wants this abuse to stop. He wants to feel human touch again. And this is kind of aided by the very simple focus of his words. You know, it's a very simple cry for help. And obviously that's going to be influenced by that very simple rhythm of just trying to make it to the next moment, make it to the next day. There is enjambment throughout the poem, and this adds to that sense of this longing and this desperation to be free of this environment and to move on from the abuse. And the enjambment also gives the reader very little time to reflect on what's being said. And so that really, really aids in expressing the length of time that the speaker has been in prison, that this length of time that's gone with abuse this entire time. You know, there's been no time to stop and kind of just pause. And by the end of this poem, we really, really feel that speaker's desire for relief, because he explains what he's gone through and why he wants to get out of prison and feel like a human being again. So let's have a read through the poem and then delve into a detailed analysis. So the poem Touch by Hugh Lewin. When I get out, I'm going to ask someone to touch me. Very gently, please, and slowly touch me. I want to learn again how life feels. I've not been touched for 7 years. For 7 years, I've been untouched, out of touch, and I've learned to know now the meaning of untouchable. Untouchable? Not quite. I can count the things that have touched me. 1. Fists. At the beginning, fierce, mad fists, beating till I remember screaming, "Don't touch me, please don't touch me." 2. Pause. The first 4 years of pause, every day, patting pause, searching, arms up, shoes off, legs apart, probing pause, systematic, heavy, indifferent, probing away all privacy. I don't want fists and paws. I want to be touched again, and to touch. I want to feel alive again. I want to say when I get out, here I am, please touch me. So it's quite a long poem. It tells really, really descriptive story of what's happened to him in prison. And the way that I've structured the analysis here, you've got the poem on the one side, you've got the analysis on the other side. So just acquaint yourself with how this looks and how it works. And let's delve into the analysis. So our first stanza says, when I get out, I'm going to ask someone to touch me. Very gently, please, and slowly. Touch me. I want to learn again how life feels. So the stanza opens up by expressing his desire to be touched when he gets out of prison and how he wants to be touched. And we see that he's very, very deliberate in explaining exactly what he wants, the details of how he wants to be touched. Starting with the when I get out implies that he is currently in jail. And you see how he's used the word when I get out, not if I get out. So there's this constant, very strong hope that he will leave this place and he will not be in this environment anymore. He will eventually get out. And in the future, he will ask someone to touch him in a manner that is different to how he is being touched now. And so that manner that he's asking is for someone to touch me very gently, please. There's a very desperate pleading tone to that very gently, please, and slowly. And so that slowly implies that human touch, gentle touch, will take getting used to. And I mean, this is very indicative of people who've been through a trauma, specifically a trauma that involves an assault or an attack, where you have to be very, very careful with somebody who's been through that kind of trauma. You can't just rush in and touch them and hug them and whatever. You have to kind of like slowly introduce them to gentle touch again. And so we see that's what's happening here again. He's going to need you to just really have patience and slowly touch him again. And so what we see where he says that I want to learn again how life feels is that gentle human touch is associated with life. It's associated with life-giving. And so his desire here is not just to be physically touched, it's to feel human again. It's to feel life again. And so he believes that gentle touch will bring him back to life, will bring him back to morality, will bring him back to goodness. And so the implication here is that the touch that he's been receiving in prison has been dehumanizing, has been deathly touch, and he needs life-giving touch once more. The second stanza says, I've not been touched for 7 years. For 7 years, I've been untouched, out of touch, and I've learned to know now the meaning of untouchable. So the second stanza tells us how long he's been in prison. That repetition of 7 years, for 7 years, is emphasizing that length of time. It's almost like you can imagine him sitting there telling the story and saying, you know, for 7 years, for 7 years. It's really that emphasizing that I've been here for 7 years. And I want you to think about how long 7 years actually is. I mean, especially if you're in matric now, I mean, 7 years ago, you were what, 11 years old. Think about how much development has taken place, how much has changed in 7 years. There's a lot that can happen in 7 years. And so when you now bring that back to the reality of the speaker, that's 7 years of abuse every single day. And so you can understand why there's this desire to be touched gently and slowly when he leaves the prison. So, like I said, the stanza speaks of how long he's been imprisoned, as well as the absence of touch, of humanizing touch, that leads to the desire that we saw in stanza 1. So that opening line explicitly shows us the need for touch. I've not been touched. And what we then see here is that he actually delves into the different types of touch. And I mean, this whole poem is about the connotations of touch and what touch means. And so here we really delve into those connotations. So we look at the first one, says, I've not been touched. That's our physical touch that he's desiring. I have been untouched. This relates to that idea of self-protection, where you withdraw yourself mentally and emotionally so that the abuse doesn't affect you mentally and emotionally. It's almost like your body goes through the physical abuse, but your mind and your soul and your heart are okay. And I want you to ask yourself, does he actually do this? You know, and is it actually possible for someone to completely withdraw themselves mentally and emotionally from the physical abuse so that they can leave mentally unharmed? You know, is that even possible? And do you think that he truly has done that? Or do you think he's trying to convince himself like, oh, this isn't bothering me. This is fine. You know, my body's going through this, but it's fine. It's fine. I want you to ask yourself that. He says, I've been out of touch. He's been away from society. He doesn't know what's going on in the world. Every day, all he knows is that he will receive physical abuse. He will be beaten. He will be searched. He will be probed. And so he's out of touch with, you know, life outside the prison. And this can also relate to being out of touch with humans and, you know, humanizing experiences and life-giving experiences. And I've learned to know now the meaning of untouchable. So untouchable there refers to that unclean, undesirable, and it alludes to the Indian, you know, the country of India, their class system with the different castes of people and untouchables being at the bottom of the social system. But it also relates to the idea of Black people during apartheid, who, you know, were completely reduced down to their passbooks, where, you know, they didn't have an identity without their passbooks, and so they were dehumanized and were seen as untouchable. And if you look at it this way, you know, Hugh Lewin was fighting the fight against apartheid, but he was fighting it as a white man. So he was fighting it from or as an ally, but not from a shared experience. And now it's almost like he's saying, oh, wow, I now actually have a shared experience with the people that I was fighting for, because I now know what it means to be untouchable. I know what it means to be looked at and thought of as nothing, and to be beaten, and for my body to just be abused just for the sake of it. And so we see these different connotations of touch and what touch can mean in different scenarios, in different situations. So just before we move on to the next stanza, I want us to quickly look again at that I've been untouched, that self-protection, that withdrawing emotionally and mentally. The next stanza says, untouched, not quite. I can count the things that have touched me. So here it tells us, oh, actually, he's not emotionally withdrawn. He's not mentally withdrawn. It has actually affected him on a deeper level. It's not just physical. And so the stanza is now shifting from that description of his desire to be touched and the type of touch to what has actually happened in prison. It's now going to tell us what he's been through and where that desire to be touched gently and slowly actually comes from. So that not quite there shows that along with the physical pain, he is feeling that emotional pain, that mental pain. He says that I can count the things that have touched me. Now, obviously, him being in prison, it's the gods that are beating him, but he does not call them humans. He does not call them gods. He refers to them as things. And so he is dehumanizing them in his poetry the way that they have dehumanized him physically. They are things, because human beings do not treat other human beings this way. Now he tells us what he's been through. So he says, one, fists. At the beginning, fierce, mad fists, beating, till I remember screaming, don't touch me, please don't touch me. So here we're seeing the physical abuse that he has suffered, and it's a very violent abuse that he's suffering, the beating and the fists. And what he's done here is he's actually used a synecdoche, however you want to pronounce it. He's used a synecdoche, which is a part that represents the whole, or a whole that represents the part, to represent the gods. The fists are what represent the gods. And again, he doesn't refer to them as gods. He refers to them by their fists, and so dehumanizing them as they have dehumanized him. So these fierce, mad fists, beating, that repetition there reflects that abuse that never stops. And it kind of gives you that image of someone just getting punched over and over and over again. There's no pause, there's no moment to breathe. And I'm sure you all have watched a movie or a series where you've seen a beating like this happen, and it's this very kind of visceral, explicit visual that you're getting here of he's just getting pounded for probably no reason, and it's just not stopping. Till I remember is that implication that this is based on an actual experience, screaming. And that screaming there has a very negative, desperate, violent connotation. He is helpless in this moment. He is weak in this moment. There is nothing he can do to stop this constant beating. And so that's a very, very negative thing. And it honestly, it gives me chills kind of every time I read this stanza, because you can just imagine this man screaming out as these gods beat him, stop touching me, don't touch me. And so there we say, screaming, don't touch me, please don't touch me. Do you see there that he doesn't use the words stop beating me or stop hitting me or stop punching me? He says don't touch me. And it continues that theme of the different connotations of touch, that he is being touched in a way that is abusive, that is violent, and it is not the way that he wants to be touched. And so it's a very, very aggressive stanza that we've got here that really kind of puts you in that moment of him just receiving blow after blow after blow, and it doesn't stop, and he has to scream at them, please stop touching me. And that don't touch me, please don't touch me really contrasts with the start of this poem that says, when I get out, I'm going to ask to be touched. I want to be touched, that kind of stuff. So we see those different connotations and how the different types of touch influence you and deeply, deeply affect you. He continues and says, to pause, the first 4 years of pause, every day, patting pause, searching, arms up, shoes off, legs apart, prodding pause, systematic, heavy, indifferent, probing away all privacy. So here he continues to explain what he has experienced in prison, and this is now moved away from physical violent abuse to very invasive, violating abuse in the form of these searches. So once again, he's using a connotation, he's using something that represents the gods, and in this one, it's pause. Now, pause has got a very animalistic, sexual predator kind of connotation here, where it's kind of grabbing, this aggressive, just touching somebody's body without their consent. And that is now what he's reduced these gods to. So first they were things, then they were just fists, and now they are just paws. These very animalistic, there's no rhyme or reason to what they're doing. They're just being violent for the sake of being violent. So he says that the first 4 years, so for 4 years, the first 4 years of his prison sentence, every single day he was subjected to these searches, to these paws that are patting him and searching him and prodding him and probing him. So there he says, searching, arms up, shoes off, legs apart. He's really showing that invasion of his body. And I mean, obviously we all know what happens with an invasive search like this. And they are stripping him of his humanity because he can't defend himself. He can't fight against this. And it's really a way for the guards to show him, we have control of you. You can do nothing about this. Your body is ours to make an example out of, to make a mockery out of, to abuse as we see fit, because you chose to stand up against apartheid. And so it's this very, all the ways that he's described this is very, very invasive. There again with the probing. Probing has a negative and invasive connotation. Probing implies that you're being violated, that it is non-consensual. The patting and the prodding pause, that provides a nice bit of alliteration that has a bit of an onomatopoeic feeling to it. It kind of sounds like you're patting someone down, and so there's really nice, along with the visuals of what's happening, there's this nice sound element that is coming in there as well. There he says systematic. That systematic means that it's daily, it's routine, and so this is something that he just knows is going to come every single day. It is systematic. And we see that he says this touch is heavy and indifferent, and that contrasts with the gentle, slow touch that he asks for in stanza 1. And so we can now also understand why he wants that gentle, slow touch, because he's been feeling heavy, indifferent touch. And it continues that idea of touch that has different connotations. And so he ends the poem by saying, I don't want fists and paws. I want to be touched again, and to touch. I want to feel alive again. I want to say when I get out, here I am, please touch me. So we're now shifting away from the description of what's happened, and we're shifting back to that original desire that we saw in stanza 1, to be touched. And again, not necessarily a physical touch, but a touch that makes him feel human again, a touch that makes him feel alive again. So the use of the word there again implies that he knows what real humanizing touch feels like. You can't have something happen again if it hasn't happened the first time. And so it's like he's reminding himself of what his life was like before this experience, and what it can be again, that he can get back to that life again. There he says, I want to feel alive again, emphasizes this long period in jail where he hasn't felt alive, where he has felt like he's dead on the inside, he's been dehumanized. And so that I want to feel alive again, that touch will bring him back to life. And there is this future hope of, I don't want fists, I want to be touched. I want to say when I get out. So there's again that, not that if I get out, it's that when I get out. There's that future hope that when he gets out of prison, he can ask someone to touch him, he can feel alive again, and he can escape prison unscathed. He can put the experience behind him. And you want to relate that back to that whole idea of being untouched. Is it possible for him to leave this experience behind and not think about it again? Is it possible for him to not be scarred by this experience? Or will he leave, and even though he gets gentle and slow touch and is made to feel human again, will he always carry the scars of what happened in this prison cell with him? That I want to say when I get out, it again relates to that future hope. He can't currently get that touch because he is in prison. And so this is his holding onto that future hope as a form of self-protection, that one day I will feel again, one day I will be alive again. Just some things to think about in your analysis of this poem is the idea that touch and being touched and experiencing different types of touch is something that everyone can relate to. It's universally understandable. And touch out of our senses is one of the strongest and most deeply personal senses. And so it's really interesting that Lewin has used the sense of touch to explain, to describe his prison experience and to show us what was happening to him. When we look at why he wrote this poem, Hugh Lewin tells a story of, a day where they had been searched and abused and beaten again. And one of his fellow political prisoners actually came up to him and said, you've got to write up what has happened and what they have done to us. And that night he wrote this poem. So it really is a part of our history. It's a moment of time in our country's history that we get to study in the form of art, in the form of literature. In writing this poem, he really focused on how your senses in general are deadened by the prison experience. And obviously that relates back to that idea of being untouched, where, this is just what we go through and we just kind of shut down so we don't have to feel it too much. And, this came from the way the guards were treating him and his fellow prisoners when they would transfer him from the cells to the workshops and back to the cells, and how they were treated. And he thought about the way that he was treated was a complete contradiction of touch, because touch is meant to have connection. It's meant to be a moment of connection. It's meant to be tender. It's meant to be comforting. And instead, touch here was being used to abuse and violate and ridicule. And so Hugh Lewin, in an interview, when asked about, how you can study this poem and what you must look for, he said, think about meaning and how something can ultimately become its own opposite. Think about how a word like touch has such a multitude of meanings, connotations, and contradictions. Reflect on the contradictions and ironies in the poem. Perhaps consider how a simple experience like touch can be explored from different points of view. It might also be useful to experiment and explore the connotations and contradictions present in other senses, such as sight and smell. So thank you so much for joining me for this lesson on touch. If you would like to access the full presentation that I've used here, you can use the QR code that is over here, or you can go to my Instagram page at Miss Shaw, go to the link in my bio, and you'll have access to my full Google Drive of different resources for English and for life orientation. So once again, thank you so much for joining me for this lesson. Please remember to go study this poem on your own and make sure you understand this poem and can explain it in your own words.